felt a need to lecture Dianne Feinstein, who was a leader on gun safety legislation, and he took that opportunity to lecture Dianne Feinstein about gun safety and her leadership on the issue. And she said to him something along the lines of, I did not sit here on this committee for however many years she did, only to be lectured by you, and that is how I feel. So why don't you just stop lecturing the rest of us? Just because you think you are the smartest person in the world doesn't mean the rest of us agree to that, okay? Thank you.
Senator Hirono,
Senator,
I knew
Cruz.
Dianne Feinstein. I served with Dianne Feinstein, and you're...
Welcome back to Freedom Forge. If you believe in freedom, the Constitution, and holding our institutions accountable, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because what we're breaking down today is something every informed citizen needs to hear. Today's Senate hearing focuses on voting rights, election laws, and the role of the Supreme Court in shaping how elections are conducted in America. Lawmakers are clashing over whether recent court decisions have weakened protections against discrimination or whether they've restored constitutional limits and fairness. At the center of this debate is the Voting Rights Act, claims of voter suppression, and accusations of political manipulation from both sides.
Lay case, and they never did.
Thank you, Mr. Grum. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's absolutely no question that racial discrimination existed in our country, and in many places, people would argue that it still does. And so we had all kinds of ways to keep black people from voting. We had poll taxes, we had literacy tests, we had, I think some places even required them to count how many jelly beans were in a jar. All kinds of ways to keep black people from voting. This happened. I don't think anybody can deny that that was going on. And as far as I'm concerned, there is a pattern now of voter suppression going on in our country right now. And the Calais decision just plays into that by pretty much gutting the Voting Rights Act, which, by the way, was reaffirmed many times in a bipartisan way in acknowledging that this kind of racial discrimination occurred, and that as a democratic country where everybody has an equal vote, that's not tolerable. But suddenly it's A-OK just because the Supreme Court says so. No, it's not the entire Supreme Court. It's a 63 majority, which I consider to be basically an out-of-control Supreme Court majority where there is a pattern of this kind of decisions out of this court. So just because this court says so doesn't mean I agree with them. So meanwhile, there is voter suppression going on. You have an attorney general who sued at least 29 states to get these states to turn over their voter rolls. Why? What does the Department of Justice, what does the executive branch want to do with all this voter information? Up to no good, I would say. There's this huge push to pass the SAVE Act. It's more Save Trump Act. And what does that act do? It would require millions and millions, all of us who are registered to vote, suddenly we will have to show proof of citizenship, either through a birth certificate or a passport. Millions of people don't have either. Married people who take their partner's name will not have a name that matches their birth certificate. So what are they going to do? There are going to be millions of people who are not even going to register to vote. And you think Trump doesn't know that? Of course he does. That's why he wants the SAVE Act to be enacted. That's why the Republicans would like to see the SAVE Act enacted, because they know that millions of people will be literally disenfranchised by not even being able to allow to vote. And then with this regime, once you do vote, they will challenge your vote as they did in the last elections. So voter suppression is going on. It's very reminiscent to the kind of stuff that was going on that the Voting Rights Act was intended to address, to fix. And now you have a Supreme Court that says, oh, never mind all of that, never mind all of that history. And over 3 cases, they succeeded in gutting the Voting Rights Act. And don't tell me that the provisions of the Voting Rights Act still exist in a way that is pretty much unenforceable, because the racial gerrymandering is going to be okay unless the legislative body that does the gerrymandering says, oh, by the way, we intend to racially discriminate. Are you crazy? You think that state legislators are going to be that overt about it? Of course not. So you have a Voting Rights Act that you claim is still intact. Please, give me a break. I have a question for Mr. Cox. Last weekend, thousands of people, and apparently you were among them, gathered to protest the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act. The central locations for these protests were Montgomery and Selma, Alabama, and both significant sites in American civil rights history. Mr. Cox, can you put this current moment into historical context for us? For instance, why is this moment reminiscent of when the last Congressman, John Lewis, who many of us consider a friend and hero, led over 600 peaceful protesters across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama?
Thank you, Senator Hirono, for that question. I think it's reminiscent and reflects the fact that the Voting Rights Act was not given to us. It was not bestowed on us. It really came from the people. And the joke I'm sort of making is that Justice O'Connor used to say were more lawyers in D.C. than people. I think we sometimes feel that way in D.C. We're on the Hill. Lawyers are at the center of the universe, and that's just not true. If we're going to climb out of this destruction of the Voting Rights Act, the penultimate destruction of our democracy, it's going to require the people. And quite frankly, we're being gaslit. We have a Supreme Court, we have allies of the Supreme Court and allies of the Calais case saying discrimination is over. Obviously not true. We have folks on the ground showing and discussing with us that law enforcement are at the polling places. We have folks not only confused, but being discriminated against right now. And I have to say that to ignore the fact that the people are demanding that Congress respond, that Congress restore the effects test that has been gutted and taken out by Calais would be a mistake. Because folks understand and know what is happening outside in the real world. And they know, particularly black voters know, that they aren't going to return to the 1800s and what we all experienced, or our ancestors experienced, that led us to the Voting Rights Act in the first place.
There is so much more to say, but I fear my time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would point out that my colleague from Hawaii questions whether or not people would be overtly discriminatory in the words that they would say. I will just point out to the California map maker who said the number one thing he was focused on was creating a racially gerrymandered district. So people do say it. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a moment ago, our colleague, Senator Hirono, said there's a lot more to say, and indeed, she's right. And in fact, I want to go back to her comments. She began by saying we have a long history of racial discrimination in this country. That's undoubtedly correct. And then she said, quote, we had poll taxes, we had literacy tests, we even had tests of how many jelly beans are in a jar. Mr. Chamberlain, when Senator Hirono says we had poll taxes, I want to ask you who we is, and in particular, what party was it that implemented poll taxes in the South?
I mean, I don't want to necessarily speak in every single case, but I'm pretty confident it was mostly the Democrats.
And what party was it that put literacy tests in place in the South?
Same answer, mostly the Democrats.
And what party was it that had tests like how many jelly beans are in a bottle?
The Democrats.
Tell me, what party were the founders of the Ku Klux Klan from?
I'm pretty sure that was the Democrats.
Indeed. In fact, Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Klan, was a delegate to the 1860 Democrat National Convention. What party wrote the Jim Crow laws in the South?
The Democrats.
And so on this side of the aisle were members of the Republican Party. Who was the first Republican president?
Abraham Lincoln.
The Republican Party was literally founded to oppose slavery. We came into existence because slavery was a grotesque evil, and it was President Lincoln, the first Republican president, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, who won the Civil War, and that resulted in the freeing of the slaves and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. By the way, fast forward to the Civil Rights era. Bull Connor, one of the most noxiously racist politicians. What party was he from?
He was a Democrat.
The Democrats, for the entire history of their party, have been a party based on racial discrimination. They affirmatively embrace it. They support it. Let me ask you, Mr. Grime, is discriminating based on race consistent with the United States Constitution?
No.
What does the 14th Amendment say about discrimination based on race?
Well, it's prohibited.
What does the 15th Amendment say about discriminating based on race, and in particular drawing congressional lines and explicitly discriminating based on race?
It's prohibited.
Now, the Democrats are fond of telling this story that is, and I wish I could find a kinder way to say it, a flat-out lie. That without discriminating based on race, that no African Americans will be elected and no Hispanics will be elected. Indeed, there was one fellow online who was a vocal left-wing spokesperson who tweeted out, "If I'm advising anybody to run for president, they sure as hell better have a solution to how you make sure that it's not another 100 years before another black person can represent South Carolina." So that's a typical Democrat statement, that we cannot elect a black person in South Carolina without discriminating based on race. I want to ask you, Mr. Chamberlain, who is the junior senator from South Carolina right now?
That would be Tim Scott.
And, all right, I'll tell you what I said online. I said, hey, Grok, who is Tim Scott, and why do Democrats think he isn't black? And by the way, was Tim Scott elected because of a gerrymandered district drawn only to elect an African American?
No, he won statewide.
He won statewide. By the way, the Democrat position is you can only elect African Americans with a gerrymandered district. I will point out Burgess Owens, an African American, is elected in a majority white district in the state of Utah. He's a Republican. Byron Donalds, another African American, is elected in a majority white district in Florida. He is a Republican. John James, another African American, is elected in a majority white district in Michigan. He is a Republican. And my own congressman, Wesley Hunt, who represents me in the House of Representatives, he is elected in a majority white district. He is a Republican. And yet, in the Democrats' world, you're not black if you're not a liberal Democrat. There is an arrogance to African American voters. By the way, they also have that same arrogance to Hispanic voters. They say you're not Hispanic if you're not a liberal Democrat. Well, I'll tell you, I am proud to be the first Hispanic ever elected to represent the state of Texas in the United States Senate. And Mr. Chamberlain, in my election in Texas, was I elected in a gerrymandered district that could only elect an Hispanic?
No, you were elected statewide.
Discrimination based on race is wrong. Final question. The Democrats are now clutching their pearls that seats drawn to elect liberal Democrats in the South are going to go away. You may get black Republicans instead. Indeed, in Tennessee, they're freaking out that a liberal white guy who's a Democrat is likely going to lose his seat to an African American woman who's a Republican, and they say that's horrible racial oppression. My final question is this. If you look nationwide, which party has egregiously abused gerrymandering for decades? Both parties are guilty of it, but who has been the worst offender? And in particular, take New England. Take Massachusetts, take Connecticut, take Rhode Island, take Maine, take Vermont, take New Hampshire. How many Republicans are elected from all of New England in the House of Representatives?
I think the answer to that is zero.
Zero. They've drawn every district in a naked gerrymander, and yet they're very upset that their illegal pursuit of power has now been stopped by the Supreme Court that is enforcing the Constitution and prohibiting the racial gerrymandering and discrimination their party is built on.
Mr.
Senator
Chairman?
Padilla.
Just a
Mr.
point
Chairman,
of
part of
clarification.
personal privilege.
Sure.
I feel personally aggrieved to sit here and to be lectured by my colleague from Texas. And this reminds me of the time when he was first elected to the Senate and the Judiciary Committee had a hearing on gun safety, and he felt a need to lecture Dianne Feinstein, who was a leader on gun safety legislation, and he took that opportunity to lecture Dianne Feinstein about gun safety and her leadership on the issue. And she said to him something along the lines of, I did not sit here on this committee for however many years she did, only to be lectured by you. And that is how I feel. So why don't you just stop lecturing the rest of us? Just because you think you are the smartest person in the world doesn't mean the rest of us agree to that, okay? Thank you.
Senator Hirono,
Senator-
I knew
Senator-
Dianne Feinstein. I served with Dianne Feinstein, and you're not Dianne Feinstein.
All right, Senator Padilla. We're done. Senator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, two quick points before I get to a couple questions.
Now let's get into what really happened here. You've got one side of the aisle arguing that America is sliding backward, that voter suppression is widespread, that minorities are being targeted, and that the Supreme Court has gutted key protections. They're pointing to historical injustices like poll taxes and literacy tests, and trying to draw a straight line from those dark chapters to what's happening today. And let's be honest, yes, those things happened. That history is real. No serious person denies that racial discrimination existed in America. But here's where things start to fall apart. Because instead of dealing with today's reality, what we're seeing is a deliberate attempt to frame modern election integrity laws as if they're the same as Jim Crow. And that's not just inaccurate, it's misleading. You heard claims in that hearing that requiring proof of citizenship to vote is somehow suppression. Think about that for a second. Voting is one of the most important rights in a democracy, and we're being told that verifying citizenship is unreasonable. That's not suppression, that's basic accountability. Then you've got this argument that millions of people won't be able to vote because of documentation issues. But what's conveniently ignored is that citizenship documentation is already required for countless aspects of everyday life: jobs, travel, government services. So why should voting be the one area where verification is considered controversial? Now here's where things really took a turn. Senator Ted Cruz came in and completely flipped the narrative. Instead of just accepting the framing that one party is the defender of civil rights, he went straight to the historical record. And what he pointed out is something a lot of people don't want to talk about. The very policies being cited, poll taxes, literacy tests, segregation laws, were enacted by Democrats in the South during that era. That's not opinion, that's documented history. And yet today, the narrative gets rewritten to suggest that only one side has ever been responsible for discrimination. That's not honest. And it matters because if you're going to use history as a weapon in today's political debate, you better be prepared to tell the full story. Cruz also made another critical point. Discrimination based on race is unconstitutional. Period. The 14th and 15th Amendments are clear on that. So when policies are proposed that explicitly factor race into districting or election outcomes, that raises serious constitutional questions. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. We're being told that without race-based districting, minorities won't be elected. But then you look at real-world examples. Senator Tim Scott, Byron Donalds, Burgess Owens, black conservatives elected in majority-white districts. That completely undermines the idea that voters are incapable of supporting candidates outside of racial lines. What does that tell you? It tells you that voters are more complex than the political narratives being pushed. Now let's talk about gerrymandering, because both sides love to accuse the other of it. The reality is both parties have engaged in it. But when one side suddenly claims moral outrage only when it loses an advantage, you have to question the consistency. If gerrymandering is wrong, it's wrong across the board, not just when it benefits your opponent. And that brings us to the bigger picture. This hearing wasn't just about voting laws. It was about control over the narrative, control over elections, and ultimately control over power. One side is arguing that stricter election laws threaten democracy. The other side is saying those laws protect it. As a right-leaning patriot, I'll tell you this clearly. A system without integrity is not a democracy worth defending. Ensuring that only eligible citizens vote is not oppression, it's common sense. Protecting the Constitution isn't extreme, it's necessary. And if we're going to have an honest conversation about voting rights in America, it needs to be grounded in facts, not fear. Because at the end of the day, The strength of this country doesn't come from political narratives. It comes from the rule of law, equal protection under that law, and a system that treats every vote with the seriousness it deserves. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe these laws are about suppression, or do you see them as protection? And if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure you like the video, subscribe to Freedom Forge, and stay tuned.